I'm going to ask each to give an opening statement, except you, Stephen.
Right. I'm done talking.
You're done talking for a while. For 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions and answers. Starting on the far left, even though she's on the far right politically, well, not really, but is my friend Laurie Higgins, who is a cultural analyst and writer with the Illinois Family Institute. I encourage all of you to read Laurie's work, which is absolutely brilliant. She's been writing for Illinois Family Institute, and that website is illinoisfamily.org for a while. She was a teacher, a writing instructor, who was sort of politically, harassed for her viewpoint discrimination, can we call it, while she was in the public school system. Next to her is Diane Gramley, who's also, all these people are a friend of mine. Well, I'm just getting to know Denise. They're wonderful people. Diane Gramley is a great pro-family activist in Pennsylvania with the AFAH, American Family Association of Pennsylvania, and just very effective. I think she's the top pro-family activist in the state, but I'm biased. Okay, next to her is Denise Shick. Her ministry is Help for Families, just Help for Families, right? That's one of your ministries. And Denise, she'll tell her story. It's a harrowing story of her childhood. I'll let her tell that, but it involves transgender issues, and so she's an expert. And if any of you need somebody to speak on ministering to those with this transgender in their lives or their contexts, Denise is the way to go with that. Just her ministry is helping people, and then my friend Stephen. So Laurie, you start, and then 3 to 5 minutes each, and then we'll go to Q&A. And when we do Q&A, Rob, let's have the people speaking in the microphone so we can get it on tape.
Okay. Well, Pete did not tell me that I was supposed to speak for 3 to 5 minutes. So what do you want me to say?
Well, I mean, just
okay.
Where we are in the culture war, how's that?
Oh, God.
Or how about the transgender issue, because you've been doing a lot of writing about that.
Yeah. Okay, so just briefly, I worked at Deerfield High School before I came to work for IFI, and what Pete was referring to, I worked at Deerfield High School full-time in the Writing Center. I was a member of the English department. I went to Deerfield High School. My husband went to Deerfield High School. All 4 of our kids went to Deerfield High School. What happened was they were teaching, well, 2 things, critical race theory, which obviously we're not going to talk about today, and they were presenting pro-homosexual resources to kids in classes. And all I said was to my colleagues and the superintendent, who the last superintendent when I was there was homosexual. He came from Ann Arbor. He'd been married and had 3 kids, and he'd left his family. And he was calling me in all the time for no evident reason, except I think it was to intimidate me, to shut me up, which I said to him once. I mean, we had kind of an interesting relationship because I wasn't just an employee. I was actually also a parent. So so all I said was, if you're going to present resources that affirm a particular position on I would argue, the single most controversial issue in America, that to do with homosexuality. I think it's even more controversial than abortion, since we're seeing sort of the culture shift on that. I said, you have a pedagogical obligation to present resources from dissenting views, and for that, I became less than persona non grata, like into some negative. The last year I was there, I was told that the following year I would be moved out of the English department, out of the Writing Center, into the bowels of the high school to proctor makeup exams. Previously, because everyone who was in there who did that work, they were a different kind of aide. I was called a Tier 1 aide, which means you do content area work. Tier 2 aides are the people who like monitor the halls and things like that. They proctored the exams, and they said they would each have an hour a day, and they came to me individually and said, Laurie, no one can do that all day. Some days you literally have no one in there. And they were giving me that gig for the entire day, every day. So I said, okay, I guess that's what God wants me to do. And then I got offered the job with IFI. But I just wanted to say, those people, English departments are notoriously bad, as is library science. Those people who claim to value diversity and honor all voices were among the worst. These were people who had been my actual friends, that had my kids in class. Some of them wouldn't sit in a room with me because I said we had to present both sides. And if I was alone in the hall with them, they wouldn't say hello to me if I said hello first. So it's utter hypocrisy that these people honor all voices. So he was saying, I write a lot about the trans issue now because it is moving at, the speed of light in the culture, like the speed of darkness, if there was such a thing. I mean, it's moving so fast, and people are not up to speed. I spoke Wednesday night. I was telling Pete at Moody Church invited me to come into a parenting class, and these are fairly young parents. They had kids, their kids were in Awanas, and they have a parenting class. I was actually really surprised at how little they knew. And so people have to, I'll just mention one thing now.
Could you mention your last article about the drug?
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, you probably all know that they give, puberty blockers to children, around age 10, 9 or 10, 9 more for girls and 10 for boys to suppress puberty. Well, I was just reading, I wrote an article last week, or the week before. There was an article in Kaiser News, Health News, which is a very well-respected medical newsletter. And it was all about this drug called Lupron, which they give to girls who are going through what they call precocious puberty, to stop the puberty because they're going through it at very, very young ages. And then, or to kids who are destined to be very short, it enables them to grow taller. Well, the Kaiser News was talking about how incredibly dangerous this drug is, and kids are having affects bone density, but they're having degenerative disc disease in their early 20s. And I mean, you find my article or find the Kaiser News. Just do Kaiser News and do Lupron, Lupron. What was interesting about the article is they didn't mention the other dominant use for this, which is what they're giving to kids who are experiencing gender dysphoria to suppress their puberty. And so I was very interested. I tried to contact the writer and say, why didn't you mention this in your newsletter, that this is the other use of this drug? So I've said this before, that I think already we're seeing, well, there are two phenomena. One is called desistance, where kids who experience gender dysphoria, unless it's affirmed by their family, their schools, their culture, upwards of 90% of them will come to accept their sex. And that's research that comes out of the secular medical community. But
their natural sex.
Except their
natural.
What did I say?
I'm just.
Oh, okay, yeah. Except they will desist from identifying as the opposite sex. But now, and that's why I say schools are complicit in this now. The whole locker room, restroom, use opposite sex pronouns in the schools. We are complicit in the damage being done to these kids. Puberty blockers, although they're portrayed as not as dangerous as the cross-sex hormones. So when they get to puberty, then these kids are given opposite sex, girls are given testosterone, boys are given estrogen. The effects of those some of the effects are permanent. Sterility is permanent. Voice changes are permanent. And there's some other more minor ones. They're doing double mastectomies on girls as young as 15 here in Illinois. So I worked with high school kids, and my tutors were the kids who were in advanced placement English classes, juniors and seniors. In other words, very bright, and for the most part, very mature kids, probably more mature than the average kid. No 18-year-old is able to make a decision about permanent sterility and double mastectomies, which leads me to the other, in addition to desistance, there's something called detransitioning, and you can go on YouTube and watch videos of people who are detransitioning, and that's people who some of them have had surgery, and many of them have taken the cross-sex hormones, and now they might now identify still as homosexual, but they don't identify they go back to their original sex, and they'll talk about being left with girls, scarred chests, and broken voices. Those things can never change. So what we're doing is really damaging kids. And there's one other thing I want to say about this, if I go over my 5 minutes that I didn't plan on, Pete. I hear people say, even some conservatives have emailed me and said this is about restroom and locker room usage. If a man has had surgery, I guess that's okay. if you've had surgery, a man, if you've been castrated, you don't turn into a woman. If physical embodiment or male or female per se means something profound, particularly about privacy, I don't care if the man in the stall next to me likes his penis, forgive me, or doesn't like it. I don't want to go to the bathroom with an unrelated man of the opposite sex
That's right.
next to me. And the same thing, my mother had breast cancer. After she had a mastectomy, she was not half man. And so physical privacy, physical embodiment of male, female matters. So here's the larger point. Where we're headed is not to allow this something less than 1% of people into private spaces, those who identify as the opposite sex. Where we are headed, and I asked Robert George, the reason I wasn't here last night was I already had tickets to hear Robert George. You know who he is? Princeton law professor, amazing guy, writes some of the best stuff on marriage. And I went to hear him speak, and I asked this question, and he confirmed it. Where we are headed is the eradication of the public recognition of sex differences everywhere for everyone. And this means, yes, it means no more sex-segregated restrooms, locker rooms, dressing rooms, semi-private hospital rooms, nursing home rooms, they just passed a law in California, athletic teams, dorms, colleges. Because if you can't discriminate either on sex or on gender identity, there's no way. So if you have a man who identifies as a woman, and by the way, the left doesn't think you need to have surgery or take cross-sex hormones or take hormone blockers or cross-dress. All they need is to say they identify as that. So if you allow one man who identifies as a woman in the restroom or locker room, and then any other man in here says, well, I want to go in there, what are they going to say? What's the school going to say? You can't come in there because you're a boy. They can say, well, no, you let that boy, objectively male person, in the restroom, and you can't discriminate based on sex, which means you can't take sex into account. And they can say, well, you're not transgender. And that person can say, no, I'm cisgender, and you can't discriminate based on gender identity. So there is no legal way to keep anyone out of entering a restroom or a locker room. And an 18-year-old transgender, it's actually a boy, but he's identifying as a girl, that I wrote about because he just this year got the JFK Award for Honor Award at Deerfield High School's graduation ceremony, and he identifies as a girl. He called to tell me that my article was filled with errors, and I said, okay, tell me what they are, I'll fix them. And he said, well, first you used the wrong pronoun. And I said, you're not a girl, you're a guy. And he goes, no, I'm female. And I said, but pronouns denote objective, immutable biological sex, and you are objectively male. And he said, no, I'm objectively female. And I said, do you know what objective means? And so, but he told me, without me asking, he said he doesn't want to just use the girls' restroom. He wants to have no more female or male restrooms.
Well, and before Diane starts talking, I think we should add a caveat to what Professor George said, and that is we are headed that way if and only if we as a larger culture allow that to go forward.
That's right.
And he was saying legally,
right,
that if we continue, that's where we're
right.
headed.
And that's what maybe God will give us the grace to have this be the stopping point. It takes a lot of work, and the other side has outworked us. That's just a fact. The other side has outworked us every step of the way.
And
because it was about I asked also about the pronoun use, because in many, many schools, the administration is sending staff and faculty, unbeknown to parents, that they must use opposite sex pronouns because they have a student who identifies as gender dysphoric. They must use those. And I asked him last night, I said, if a school says that and a teacher refuses and they're somehow penalized, whether they're fired or, some other kind of consequence, I said, would they have a case for a lawsuit? And he said yes. Yeah,
and in California, they've just passed legislation which would effectively, I think the fine is $100,000, could be, if that.
Are you talking about the nursing home one?
No, I'm talking about misgendering.
Oh,
misgendering.
Yes.
We're headed to that being a crime. And that's why I raised the question of the Daily Caller. And Diane, you're next. But how is there any hope for us to stop the pronoun police, as I call them, If the conservative press is already calling Bruce, so-called Caitlyn Jenner, a she, if the Daily Caller is and Fox News is calling Bruce Jenner a she, how are we going to stop this? So we'll start with the conservatives and demand that the conservatives, number one, not call counterfeit marriage marriage. That's why I always put it in quotes. It's not marriage, so don't call it a marriage. Even some Christian publications now, I don't know if Christianity Today refers to it as same-sex marriage, but do not call somebody who is a biological male a she.
And I would say this is, we don't get to choose who God puts on the front lines. And right now in these culture battles, it's people in wedding relating industries and in public schools. And I have yet to hear of a Christian teacher telling their administration, I will not use opposite sex pronouns. John Piper has a great teaching on this. It's very brief. It's an audio thing. And he said he doesn't care about proper names because they're sort of culturally arbitrary. My older brother's name is Leslie. Before 1950, that was only a guy's name, and then it switched. But he said pronouns, you cannot use opposite sex pronouns. It is bearing false witness. And you need to tell whether it's corporate or schools, you won't do it and start looking for a new job. And I would say, if you know anyone who teaches in a public school, ask them. What are you going to do? Has your school done it yet? Because a lot of schools have already done this. And if so, what are you going to do? Because Christian teachers in public schools are failing. When I worked at Deerfield High School, I couldn't get Christian teachers to come alongside me. Okay, well, then I have a question for Diane for you to answer to start out your talk. And same thing for you.
I was just going to say they also outfund us.
Yes, outfund us. And Denise, I would like you to answer this same question that I'm going to ask. What do you say to the person who, on the left or in the media, who says, Diane, you won't call this transgender person by the pronoun he wants. Why are you so hateful? Why do you intentionally misgender this person? What's your response to that?
Well, my response would be that science is on our side. And when it comes to chromosomes, they can never change. No matter what you do to your physical body, that person's still a male or female. And I mean, conservatives are accused of being anti-science when it comes to climate change and things like that. But when it comes to true science, where there's not been any gay gene found, and there's no evidence that a male can change into a female or a female can change into a male, the science is on our side. And, I question the reporter as far as, are you a science denier? Something along those lines, because science is definitely on our side. And in Pennsylvania, fortunately, we have Philadelphia to deal with. Of course, you guys have Chicago to deal with. But it's an ongoing battle, and Laurie, she outlined a lot of the stuff that's going on in Pennsylvania as far as the schools in the Philadelphia area, in the southeast area. And that was one of the things, or that was the thing that got me involved with the AFA. We had the only American Family Radio station in the state for a long time. And it went on the air in November of '98. In April of '99, I heard this guy named Jim Metrock with Obligation talking about an in-school news program called Channel 1. And this was on AFR, and with Don Wildman, I can't remember the name of the program right now, but he was talking about this in-school news program called Channel 1 and talking about all the terrible news stories that they were talking about, the liberal slant. It's in addition to the advertising that was included in that. But I was innocently taking the dog to the vet as I was listening to this program with Brother Don and Jim Metrock. And I thought, that's not in our school. Anyway, when the dog and I got home, and our kids got home from school, I asked them if it was in our school. It's a high school program, is what it is. It's 12 minutes usually shown during homeroom. Anyway, I asked our kids if that was shown in school, and our daughter said, oh, yeah. So that was what got me involved, was public school issues, specifically Channel 1. And anyway, history, that ended up with AFA National asking me to start, at that point, AFA of Northwestern Pennsylvania, that escalated into AFA of PA. But public school issues, and it's even worse now than it was back then in 2000, in '99 and 2000. But in 2003, I pulled our two youngest ones out of school. They were in their high school years, and I pulled them out because things were getting so bad, and I was becoming more involved with AFA and didn't want any pushback against them. So that's kind of some of the history of how I got involved with AFA. But as we've seen things escalate, and I thought for sure, as we fought the homosexuality, one thing I said, Lord, yes, I'll be involved with AFA, but I will not be involved with the issue of homosexuality or pornography. Guess what two issues I'm involved with, fighting those two issues. But fighting the homosexual issue definitely has been, they think they've won. And as we look at the culture, they've won a whole lot. But I thought surely with the transgender issue that parents would stand up and say, no, you're not going to allow that boy who thinks he's a girl in my daughter's bathroom or shower room. And some parents have stood up. I know here in Illinois there are parents who stood up in several of the school districts who are pushing these gender identity policies. And the pushback they got against them, not only from other parents, I think some of the promoters of this stuff were bussed in from other districts, but it wasn't only the promoters of the transgender issue, but it was also administration. And when we think of what happened in California with the Rockland Academy in kindergarten, when we had a kindergarten teacher at the end of school last year helped this kindergarten boy come out as a girl in class, and the trauma that it caused the kids, and the pushback that these concerned parents who knew nothing about this having happened in their class, their children's class, they only heard it from their children. As some little girls would cry because they were afraid they're going to wake up the next morning as a boy. And the trauma that they went through. And this is totally being ignored by the media. I mean, the media, as Peter's has been saying throughout this weekend, the media is complicit with all this stuff. And they're totally on board with all this stuff. And Fox News was a sponsor. It was in Philadelphia this year with the National Gay and Lesbian Journalists Association. Fox News was one of the sponsors of that.
Fox News has sponsored the Gay Journalists Association for every year with a $10,000 gift.
And that's one of the things they do there is they teach them to use the correct pronoun when they report. Like Bruce Jenner is a she, or I'm sorry, Caitlyn is a she. So that's all. They're educating. They're outfunding us, as has been mentioned, but they're teaching these journalists the politically correct terms. And they're teaching the future teachers are being taught in the teaching colleges. We have some of the biggest teacher colleges in Pennsylvania. I mean, in the nation that are located in Pennsylvania, but they are being taught. GLSEN is partnering with, I think it's the University of Pittsburgh.
GLSEN is
a Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, and they were very much involved in getting school districts to put Gay Straight Alliance clubs in the schools, but they're also now going beyond that, and in one case, partnering with University of Pittsburgh to teach these future teachers to be accepting of homosexuality and of now transgenderism, and to make sure they use the right pronouns. Even when some schools have gone as far as passing policies that require that the correct pronoun be used for. I don't want to say correct because it's actually the incorrect pronoun, but
the false pronoun.
It gets very complicated when it comes to he and she and all this stuff. But the ones the pronoun that the child who thinks that they're the opposite sex, they're supposed to be using the pronoun that child wants. And teachers are being taught you have to do this because otherwise you're going to cause trauma for this student because you're denying the student who he or she really thinks he or she is. So, I mean, public school is still a big issue with me because it's so concerning because that's the future of America. And
Diane, can I ask you something on that? We have, I think one of the reasons we are so far behind is we focused all our energies, most of them in the pro-family movement, on Washington. Yeah. We were not active in the culture. We did not make children the number one issue. It's just a fact. Some people like Laurie have and Linda Harvey and such, but We spent a lot of our time arguing, fighting the battles in Washington, fighting the gay marriage issue. Meanwhile, they were infiltrating the schools. And so now we have generations of kids who are effective propagandists for the other side.
Absolutely. And
Can we get that back? Can we return the fight to where I think the most important part is we have to reach the next generation?
We have to reach the next generation, but I think that's where the church has got to step in. And the church has to step in, but then again, when you look at the culture around us, they're not here. They're not in the church on a Sunday morning. Church is no longer relevant. And I believe part of that is because the church has stepped out of the culture, has stepped out of the culture, decades ago. So the church is no longer relevant. And the church needs to retake its rightful position in culture, because we're called to be salt and light. And we can't do that inside these four walls. And that's a difficult thing, because culture views the church as irrelevant, as the message is hateful and bigoted. I mean, that's the way that the culture views our message. And that's why Stephen was so good about explaining how we have to become more effective in lovingly speaking the truth of the gospel and of God's love, but of God's expectation that we change, we turn away from our sinful ways. And we have to learn how to do that in 1 minute. I guess that's what our limit is. Which is good, because because when we're talking about the media, you don't have time. You have to be able to articulate what you want to say immediately, and then hope they don't chop down your minute to 10 seconds, which they do that too. But anyway, the schools taking it back, I don't know. We've had situations, again, well, not just, but mostly in southeastern PA, where they've been passing these ordinances. This was several years ago, not ordinances, but policies in schools, where it's the kids who are out there telling their sad stories, the ones who identify as homosexual and transgender, telling their sad stories about how if the school doesn't change their policy, they're haters, and the only way that we can fully be accepted is if the policies are changed to where they are affirming to us. So kids, they've been indoctrinated for so long, I don't know. I really don't know.
Well, that takes me to Denise. And Denise, I guess we should start by, I want to hear your answer to that question. But first, let's hear your amazing testimony of what happened in your life.
Okay, I'm going to do this really fast forward for you. At the age of 9, my father had told me that he identified as being a woman, that his dream was really to become a woman. So at that young age, if you can imagine a 9-year-old girl or boy, you go through an immediate grieving process that you've just lost that parent, not realizing what that had really meant to me, and kind of separating my dad from myself, thinking this really doesn't impact me. But I had discovered soon afterwards that it did in many different facets. For instance, by the time I was 11, I started to mature very young, and really felt uncomfortable around my dad in a way that I wanted to hide the femininity, hide the part that my body was developing biologically as it should. It also created an envious relationship between my dad and I, and just the way he'd look at me. He was very jealous of what I was becoming. So, that created even more tension in our home. By the age of 12, there was some inappropriate touching that he would do when my mother wasn't home. So when we talk about, pedophile and then just the different things that this does have a part of, there was pornography up in the home, in the attic. By the time I was 14, I was right around his size, so I started to discover my clothing up in the attic, in the truck, in various places, behind the towels in the bathroom, where I realized, after I come out of that denial of what is really happening, that Dad is wearing my clothes. By 15, I started to use any lunch money I had to deal with this through alcohol. I was seeking the attention of a male attention, that affirmation I didn't get from my father. So that had created an environment where I looked in many wrong places, and thank God that he had saved me in times that he had done. By the age of 15, I was suicidal. I was looking at different ways to end my life, as we all talked about, how the enemy works when we're children.
Yeah.
I already had it planned out what I was going to do, and it was only by the grace of God with having the shows, if any of you guys are older like some of us here, with Phil Donahue. And he had a show on teenage suicide. Yes. And I'll never forget that. It was a day where we didn't have school, and it was a boy that had tried to shoot himself, which was exactly what I had planned. And he was in a coma. And to me, there was more fear in me of not being successful in that, and actually thinking that I'd remain at home and I'd still hear my dad's voice, rather than to be dead and in the ground. And so just hearing that story and thinking, I can't do this, that would be so far worse for me. But by the age of 16, a young Christian man came into my life, and through that relationship, I had married my husband, Mark, a couple months after graduation. Now, on my wedding day, another part of devastation or just like shock had happened. I thought, we don't talk about this. So many families live in that denial. The hurt, the grieving, and thinking maybe Dad's over this, not understanding at the age of 18 this type of bondage. And so I went to meet my dad at the church doors, put my arm in his, and he turned and he looked at me and he said, "I wish it were me in that gown." And I thought, dear God, this hasn't gone away. But my dad had looked at me and said, "I wish it were me in that gown." And so there I am with a church full of people and trying to put a smile on my face so that I look happy to meet my groom.
Can I interject here?
Yes.
I'm having a hard time understanding such selfishness.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't believe, even if you thought it, that
So
you would say that to your daughter on her wedding day. It's just astonishing.
So sorry, Denise.
Yeah, and I realized the selfishness, but I also realized the illnesses, you know, the sickness that was surrounding him, in a sense. Did your mother know? My mother did know. Back in the day when they got married, it was one of those where you think you're going to get married and it's going to, you know, kind of go away. And my mother came from a broken family of her own, you know, in a sense. So there was the dynamics that brought two people together and, you know, created the situation that it had.
Did you have siblings?
I am the oldest of 5 siblings. And so during also these years, I became the protector of them, because I'm thinking, if they know what Dad's really doing, or if Dad really feels, would that affect my brothers being men, you know, and not wanting them to insert any of these suggestives into their own heart and soul. And with my sister, the only thing that I told her when she became young enough where she was developing is, if Dad ever touches you, you let me know. And she never asked about it, and I already knew I would shoot him, and I knew I'd go to jail, and I really didn't care, to be honest with you. So my mother worked afternoons, so I was the caretaker in the evening of the children and trying to keep them out of Dad's harm.
Did your brothers ever find out?
Not until they were older, yeah. It would have been about 10 years after I was married, and my father had then made the decision to leave my mother after 35 years of marriage to become Becky. And so then our family walked through that journey for 13 years. As my dad was dying of esophagus cancer, reached out to the family, and my mother had come over to let me know he was dying, and my heart was hard. That's really what I teach about so much about, is forgiveness, because I know how hard that heart was, and you couldn't have cracked it with an axe. I was hurt. I was grieving. I still that long, you know, you're 38 years old, and you're realizing even at 38 how much you really are hurting inside. Yeah. And so it was walking those last 6 months out with my dad that I held him accountable as an adult, and that was really another difficult journey that as I walked through, because 13 years went by, I didn't see my dad. Those decisions were made because of boundaries that my husband and I were raising 4 small children under the age of 4, twin boys and 2 little girls. And I'm thinking, both of us, we can't bring them into this. They have a grandpa. Wait a minute, they don't have a grandpa. They got a grandma. You know, all of this. It just was too crazy. So it was just walking those last 6 months of forgiveness, of holding him accountable, and learning more about this from an adult level. And like so many of us, just thought we'd never be speaking publicly on this, didn't want to do it, told God no for over 2 years, the audacity that I had to do that. And he did not give up. I never had felt a burden on my heart as he had done. Never have I experienced anything like that. Felt like a huge boulder that somebody had just strapped it around my chest, and I could not shake it. And it finally got at prayer time where I was down on my knees, and I said, you've got to open up a door. You have got to take this from me, because I just felt like I was going to die. And so we've been doing this kind of ministry for 15 years, coming alongside and supporting families that have loved ones that identify as transgender, and we as well support individuals that struggle with this issue or those that are taking back the life that Satan had stolen from them. So it's really coming alongside of the family unit and supporting them, and what kind of help do they need, what type of assistance, and how can we come alongside of them in this time.
Can you tell us a hopeful story of somebody who came to you needing help and something that Help for Families did?
Sure. We have John, who writes sometimes for our newsletters. He's in Canada. He actually was a transgender activist. And his story is when he had contacted us, he was suicidal. And he said, his name, he went by Becky as well. And he said, you don't know how long I've been holding out, reaching out to you, because I wasn't sure what this would do to you. And so the neat part with him is that today he is a part of the support group for the individuals that are taking back their lives, including, the newsletters. He also was one of the individuals that's been interviewed with World Magazine when they had contacted me asking for different individuals that no longer were identifying as transgender, and so John was one of those that was interviewed in that article as well. I can tell you that as of this morning, Stephen, when you were talking, I didn't just walk out on you. I had received a text because of accountability, and we have a fairly young guy that's now walking away from this life as well, and he's just had some real trouble in the 48 hours. You see, what we don't hear about as well is how the LGBT treats the individuals when they say, this is not how I'm going to live anymore.
Yeah.
And this man is just going through a real loss because he's looking for the church, he's looking for new friends. In the meantime, his old friends aren't wanting anything to do with him.
Right.
And his friend called him last night asking for a ride to go have sex reassignment surgery where it was scheduled for today. And he told him no. So it's a very difficult situation that people are having that are saying, I'm no longer identifying in this way. And I realize, as he had said, I had some mental issues going on, and it didn't fix it. And those were my dad's final words. It did not fix what I thought it would. So when we've got individuals...
That was the last words your father...
One of the last things that my father had shared, this did not fix me.
And now I'll rephrase the question I asked before. I talked about before sometimes, the ministry versus the culture, the culture opposition. How do you abide that thing? I mean, you're in ministry work mainly. You also speak, and you're answering the lies of the culture. How do you synthesize those two aspects of being a Christian in our culture? We want to reach out in love. We also want to not call a man a she. I mean, how do you handle it, and what advice would you give to people to do well in that area?
I think one of the things that we have to remember is that the tone of our heart can be heard. So the tone of how we speak this and the words that we choose is part of how we have to be cautious of. And once we say something or once that tone's out there. And I say that because it is in love that we speak the truth. With my dad, I never called him Becky. I was in the hospital room with LGBT folks, the professional staff, medical staff, that had to refer him to as Becky. And I can tell you that I stood there in that room, and I mean, you mean my dad, he, him, and most people would look at that like that's being a really stubborn, hurt daughter, right? It wasn't done in the spirit of that. It was done that this was the only way my dad was going to remember who he really was. He was not born a girl. Biologically, he was a son. He became a husband, a dad, and a grandfather. And so my dad, I was fortunate because he did not take it, in that manner. The one thing that we can't be responsible for is how somebody is going to take what we say. And that's where we've got to release it and leave it to God, but to be accountable to God in our actions and showing that love. But if we're going to speak in love. We're going to speak in truth.
Right. Now, I'm just curious. What did you ever uncover? What were the roots of your dad's gender confusion?
He had actually told me at 9 years old, Peter, that he had been sexually molested. Surprise. As well as by the time he was 7, he had an older brother and the older buddies, the friends of his brothers, and they had put him in his sister's dress and stuffed him in a closet. His mother was an alcoholic. My grandfather was a very busy businessman trying to self-start a business and really didn't have the time with his son. There was a real disconnect all through my dad and my grandfather's life. So even at 9 years old, I'm thinking, I understand this, don't you get this? You know, and the whole time growing up. So those were the
So once again, we're seeing the connection between abuse and basically sexual and gender confusion. And I have to confess that one of the mistakes I've made in fighting the whole overall LGBT movement is we were so careful as to not exaggerate the movement, because one of my rules is you never exaggerate the gay or now the transgender agenda. There's no need to exaggerate. It's just ridiculous. It's like saying the Nazis killed 14 million people as opposed to 6. We never wanted to exaggerate, and so we did not want to exaggerate the child sexual abuse. But I think effectively what some of us did was understate it. When you hear the testimonies of Stephen saying, what was it, over 50 or 60, 5% of people had some sort of abuse. And so, of course, we don't want to say, oh, we're not saying gays are pedophiles, but there's this reality of these incredibly traumatic events or predatory or abusive events, which, of course, are going to have real-life impact. And what the other side is saying is it has no relation. As I mentioned, Don Lemon, he was molested. Anchor from CNN, no connection. Oh, he's just gay. There are straight people who were molested too. These are the responses that come back. So, you know, we have to find a way to get this truth out because the media will not make any connection. That's even something that's so basic as that. They will say that's not true.
And if we go along with this, conclude to this delusion of what's going on in society, what would we be doing by telling somebody, oh, Stephen, hi, Stephanie, how are you?
Yeah.
What about physically what we're encouraging, and now with our young people, with what's going on? I cannot believe that we are living in a culture that is not thinking about the consequences of these hormones when it delays bone growth, when you're talking about a higher chance of cancers,
right,
with liver damage, with gallbladder issues, with doubles their chances of high blood pressure. It's like, what are we doing? Just as much with depression, anxiety. We are setting these children up for a lifetime need of the community, of the medical and psychological field, is what we're doing.
Well, aren't the professionals complicit in that? I mean, that's
Yes.
and who's making the money? I mean, there's somebody's making a lot of
Exactly.
money on this.
Exactly. They are, yes.
I want to
Stephen?
speak to
Go
the,
ahead, take the mic.
pronoun. I've got one. I've got my own. The whole pronoun thing, like when somebody's coming, because I've had the honor to minister to several people that have dealt with the trans issue, is, of course, in our environment, we're going to tell them up front that we're going to come from a biblical worldview. But I really loved what Joseph Dr. Nicolosi said in his practice when he dealt with that. He just would, at first, he would not initiate either way. He would just call them by a name, and then until he was able to get them to see their need, and then that's when you would start making the switch. Of course, we're a little bit more upfront as a ministry that we're not going to compromise in your God-given gender, and I say, is that okay? I want to respect you, but can you respect me as well? Because I feel like this is a very unloving thing, and you may not totally understand that right now, but it actually violates my conscience. And so to actually have that discussion when you're ministering to somebody, you find that they will be okay with it. It's
The way you phrase it is
pretty
beautiful.
ironic.
Respect
actually.
our conscience. I mean, there's a reality that there's not a lot of respect of conscience. I mean, that's the whole reason that
Right.
Jack
But
Phillips is at the Supreme Court. They didn't respect his conscience right not to bake a cake honoring counterfeit marriage.
Right.
But you're right. We have to state it. It's all about our conscience. Whether you're religious or not, by the way, we're not talking about special rights for Christians.
Right.
I've gotten support from atheists, believe it or not, who say, I don't agree with you. I don't want to hear about your Christ. But I am totally with you on the morality of marriage. I've gotten letters from people. We are not asking for special rights for religious people. We are asking for the right to live by our moral code, according to our conscience, and not be bludgeoned, bullied by the power of the state, which is what these laws do. Remember, they all started through laws. The Boy Scouts were dragged through the court system. It all began when a gay activist demanded the right to be an assistant scout leader, a gay activist. And then that's what started the Boy Scouts. Now, I guarantee you that he was from New Jersey. New Jersey had passed a sexual orientation law. I guarantee you, I haven't gone back and said it, but you could go back to the debate in New Jersey, and I will guarantee you that there was not one bit of discussion about how this sexual orientation law was going to compel groups like the Boy Scouts to violate their creed to be morally straight and reverent toward God. So in other words, the law of unintended consequences, these laws, calling unequal things equal, end up having far-reaching effects, and it still happens to this day, because the gay lobby and now the trans lobby is always saying, we respect your rights. I believe there will come a day when they will come after, they're already doing it in other countries, I think here as well, they're going to come after pastors who will not marry a homosexual couple.
It has happened.
And there will
Europe.
be legal action.
Yes, it's already happened.
Right. And what's happening
Europe.
in the Catholic schools? There's several Catholic schools now where they discover that a teacher is homosexual and homosexually, quote unquote, married, and that school is being sued when they say, I'm sorry, you can no longer be a teacher because it violates our faith creed to not have, we oppose homosexual marriage. They are being sued, even though they are a Catholic or a religious institution. So that respect of conscience is decidedly lacking, but we got to fight the fight.
Yes.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
On speaking the truth. Okay, so when we get back to in regards to speaking the truth and with what's happening with the children, is it really worth putting them in that 41% attempted suicide rate where 31% are successful?
So explain those statistics.
Yeah, so 41% of those that identify as being transgender, live as transgender, put themselves under that category. You have 41% of these folks that will attempt suicide. 31% will be successful in that attempt. That is not showing the Lord's compassion.
Okay, do we have questions? And let's go to the microphone. Rob, can you give the mic to anybody who has a question? Carolyn, you want to go first? Or Rob, and also you had a question as well, Rob, right?
Oh yeah.
But let's go. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Carolyn.
Well, I'm just devastated by what's happening to our children. And after us older people are gone, who's there to complain and try to put things back together? I worry and wonder what we can do. I mean, it's so far advanced by now. And also, I just wanted to say that when Obama was in office, he had the medical profession, the psychiatric profession, prevented from counseling children. Parents could not take their children to anybody for counseling. I'm wondering...
Well, let's clarify that. He favored a federal law. That has not passed yet, but several states, as we've discussed before, have banned I'll see if Laurie, correct me if I'm not phrasing this right. Several states, including Connecticut, states even with Republican governors like New Jersey, Chris Christie, and the New Mexico mayor, Susana, I can't remember her last name, Republican governored states even have passed and signed legislation which would effectively ban taking a child who's embraced or who's even a child who had been victim by a predator to counseling which would not affirm LGBT lifestyles.
Oh my gosh.
Well, Illinois was even...
Oh, wait, we need the mic. Sorry.
Yeah, and it was Rauner who signed it into law. What they call the conversion therapy ban, is that what you're talking about? Yeah. And what was even more problematic here in Illinois is, in most states they distinguish, and leftists do in general, between sexual orientation and gender identity. So you can have sexual orientation in your anti-discrimination law, for example, but in Illinois, the Illinois Human Rights Act actually says that sexual orientation includes gender identity. So when they passed the conversion therapy ban, which prohibits parents from getting counseling for minors for their sexual orientation, that actually includes gender identity, so if they experience gender dysphoria. And what was interesting is there are two sex researchers, liberal, J. Michael Bailey at Northwestern, who's, I think, a weirdo, but he was right on this, and Eric Villain at UCLA, who came out and had a syndicated editorial saying they're on board the conversion therapy bans against minors getting, for same-sex attraction, but they oppose any kind of bans on minors getting help for their unwanted gender dysphoria because of the high desistance rate. So they said...
Explain that,
the desistance rate, I already talked about that. You must not have.
Say it again, for us slow people.
The desistance is when they experience gender dysphoria, identify as the opposite sex, but by late adolescence, they come to accept their real sex. Because that rate is so high, they said we shouldn't ban therapy for gender identity issues. And yet we did here in Illinois effectively do that. Can I say a couple of things?
But before you say that, I want you to address the first part. They said they were okay with sexual orientation. And what flabbergasts me is, even if somebody was molested by an adult homosexual predator, that child could not be taken to somebody who did not want that child to think he's gay.
Exactly. Well, there's a lot to say about that, because I had written about that specifically, that was a question we should have asked our lawmakers. Someone should have stood on the floor and said, what if a child has been sexually molested? Oprah, maybe some of you people, you mentioned Phil Donahue, the last year of her, did you see that two-part? It was an audience of all men who had been molested. And they had... Howard Fradkin was this counselor who's homosexual himself and counsels people who have been molested. And in the first part of that, he actually said children who have been sexually molested can experience sexual orientation confusion. And I was like, are you kidding me? Did he just say that? Well, the next day he came back, and Oprah gave him a chance to clarify. And what he said was he wanted to make clear that sexual molestation can't cause homosexuality. It can cause sexual orientation confusion, meaning those people who are going to be homosexual anyway, it can't create that. It would create confusion in those who are actually heterosexual, but because of the molestation, they think they're homosexual. It's goofy.
That is complete doublespeak.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. That's right. And the minors, because they don't know a lot. Exactly.
Yeah, let me repeat what you just said. You said the people who are heterosexual, and again, the whole thing is, who do they...
They're still operating on the born that way theory.
Right.
Even though the left, maybe a lot of people don't know, leftist scholars in the academy, homosexuals, Lisa Diamond is the name you'll see the most often, will have come out, they've been long saying sexual orientation is fluid, it's not fixed. That's what the scholars have been saying in the academy, and the press will not cover it. And so, but also what you were saying, children who were sexually molested and experience same-sex attraction don't know the connection. That's the whole problem. A 10-year-old, a 12-year-old who was molested when he was 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 and he's experiencing same-sex attraction, he can't put that together. They need help putting that together. It's not like they go, oh, wait, I was born that way or I was not born that way. What child can do that? That's why they need counseling. And that's why I said we have these cowardly lawmakers. And when we were doing, it was comprehensive sex ed, we had a lawmaker who shall remain nameless, mainly because I've forgotten his name. But I wouldn't name him anyway. But he agreed to ask all these questions, because when they proposed the comprehensive sex ed bill here in Illinois, the lawmakers who sponsored it said that this bill was needed in order to, because we have such high rates of unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. And then they went on and they actually presented zero evidence that comprehensive sex ed does that. And so I wrote an article about this, and then the next day Robin Gable in Evanston came out and she presented a study, and it actually had nothing to do with it. It was like, so anyways, I had created this whole list of questions for this lawmaker who said he would ask them. And I worked a little bit with debate when I was at Deerfield High School, so I know how to construct questions that it doesn't matter how they answer it, the truth will come out in the asking of the question, and she wouldn't have been able to answer them anyway. And he didn't ask one of them, and he just made one of his pontificating statements, which is what our lawmakers do. So, okay.
Well, okay, wait, I'm going to stop you there, and here's why. Because libertarians and conservatives talk about freedom all the time and the importance of liberty, and yet they haven't barely lifted a finger to defend against these bans, which is why in some states, especially after Trump won, you'll notice that some of these bans were passing very, very rapidly. One, I think it was, I can't remember if it was Rhode Island or Connecticut, there was literally no Republicans who voted no. And so if we can't even get the Republican Party to defend the rights of children to receive help, even children who were sexually abused, you know, don't talk to me about liberty. And so again, Brian Kamaker makes the point. If we're now going to say that the main thing we're defending is religious freedom, well, then we have to exercise our religious freedom and defend the truth that homosexual practice is wrong or that transgenderism is wrong. If we just talk about freedom, we're too scared to even defend against leftist laws. And by the way, in the latest, who's the guy who does the undercover videos? Who's that? O'Keefe. In the latest James O'Keefe video, he did an undercover video on a English New York Times writer. She's in charge of curating the website, and he basically got her to admit that they look for stuff, they're against Trump, and they put all this Trump stuff up because it's selling papers and liberals are buying subscriptions, and as you know, the newspaper industry is dying. But in the one reference she made, she talked about Pence, and she said, Pence, you know, he was for that conversion ban, and she said, you know, that stuff's got I think she said electro-torture.
I thought you said electrocution.
Electrocution, yeah.
Right.
So she was referring to some bygone era where they had electrotherapy to try to get guys who thought they were gay and to try to change them. It has nothing to do with the talk therapy of today. And this is a journalist. Journalists are supposed to be more informed than the rest of us. And it just shows that even the journalists are trafficking these absurd lies because they're so wedded to the LGBT movement, they don't even know how ignorant they are. And these are the journalists. So that's why I keep coming back to the conservatives and these reparative therapy bans. We've got to start with conservatives, as Laurie does. She tries to educate the conservatives, but as you just said, they won't even ask questions sometimes. They won't even stand up.
This is the irony about those conversion therapy bans. So now minors...
So-called, because that's a bad name. That's the name the left uses.
That's what the left uses. So minors now can access medical help in rejecting their unwanted, unchosen bodies, but they can't get medical help for rejecting their unwanted, unchosen same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. A 15-year-old can get a double mastectomy, but a 17-year-old can't go in and have counseling for their unwanted same-sex attraction. I mean,
okay, but I got a question for both you and Denise on that. Don't the world standards for this transgender transition, don't the world standards say that the minors are not supposed to get this? So how do we come to the point where minors are getting these radical body disfigurations? I thought didn't their own standards say that that's not supposed to be the case?
They don't do bottom surgery but they will do, although wait, wasn't there one boy in Pennsylvania that had some, I don't know if it was...
Well, Jazz Jennings is planning on doing it, right?
Yeah.
That did happen in Bucks County, which is again near Philadelphia. But he had the parents gave the okay on it. That was why it happened.
But see, the conversion therapy ban, so-called, even if your parents agree to it, you can't have counseling. And yet, one boy, you can get a double mastectomy here in Illinois if you're 15.
Okay, so correct me on this. Tell me if I'm right. So if I'm in Illinois or one of these states, God forbid, my son, who's, say, 12 years old, gets sexually molested by a male predator who's 25, in the state of Illinois, I cannot take him to a pro-heterosexual therapist who wants to just, we both agree we don't want my son to think that he's gay because I cannot do that. I have to go out of state to another state that doesn't have such a ban.
And remember, didn't they, in the initial form of the bill, didn't they actually try to put something in there about not going out of state too? That there was going to be some kind of, and I think that was, I shouldn't say that. I think that is the case. But I just wanted to say.
Well, is that true? Is my statement true?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know how. Like, if a parent just takes their child to a counselor and says, I want him to have counseling for molestation, and doesn't specifically address the homosexuality, they can probably get, and I'm sure there are good counselors who are, yes, you had some.
This is one of the topics that I really know about.
Yeah,
That's what I was
get
going
in
to
the
say.
mic.
Oh, you want this?
Can I, just for a second?
Yeah. No.
The therapy ban thing is something I've been following for the last year because in my district, across the street is my representative who introduced it in Minnesota. And I've been following this website, therapyequality.org, and they're tracking all of the bills that have been banning therapy. And one of the leaders of the Therapy Equality, I was talking to him, and he was explaining, to your point, that if someone is in New Jersey, where it's illegal for heterosexual affirming therapy for a child that is identified as heterosexual but is suffering from molestation and has confusing same-sex attraction and wants to get therapy, he can't get it in New Jersey. But the law makes it so that if a therapist refers him out of state, that therapist can lose their license.
Wow.
I think they tried to do it in Illinois.
Wow.
And on top of it, as a parent, and you got to understand the spirit behind this. And then as a parent, if you want therapy for your child in New Jersey and you take them across state lines, you're opening yourself up to child protection services because that's cruel and unusual punishment or cruel and unusual behavior for a child to deny them who they are, quote, 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 who they are. So this is just evil to destroy the children. And in therapyequality.org, they've put in a...
Now, therapyequality.org is a pro-gay site?
No.
Oh, they're the good guys. Okay, they're the good guys. Okay.
They're the good guys. They're actually the people that are actually writing the legislators. If you go out there, they have all the letters.
Is that Christopher Doyle?
It's Christopher Doyle,
Okay.
David Pickup.
Yep.
It's that group. And so when Seattle... the mayor in Seattle had to resign because it came out that he was molesting children, his foster son and that kind of stuff. Well, on Therapy Equality, they petitioned to have him, at first he wasn't resigning. And so they petitioned, city council, ask him to resign and repeal that ban. Because his own children could have same-sex attraction. These children that he abused could have unwanted same-sex attraction, that they're confused, identified as heterosexual, and they're not allowed to get the therapy in that city, in Seattle. And they're like,
and he co-sponsored the ban.
Exactly, and he passed the bill. So it's blatantly out there that it's language matters. So I don't call them conversion therapy bans, but I'm trying to explain this to people. I say it's anti-heterosexual affirming therapy bans. It's a one-way street. You can only go gay with that therapy. Right. So people that have been suffering with unwanted same-sex attraction, it's ego-dystonic. That's not who my ideal self is, and therapy helps deal with behaviors. I'm acting out on something that I don't know why, and it turns out it's my brokenness, it's abuse, it's whatever those things are. You're not allowed to get therapy, and it's just talk therapy. And the lie is this electroshock therapy and aversion therapy.
Yeah.
But
what's that?
Bigfoot.
What's Bigfoot?
Bigfoot is this fuzzy image of this creature that everybody keeps talking about.
Yeah, say that into the mic.
Is this not on?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Bigfoot.
I'm sorry.
It's Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And Joe Dallas was interviewed in the Huffington Post about the situation that I was involved in, and in California, and it's that fuzzy image that everybody keeps talking about, that we had a machine in our basement, a machine in the basement of the church and this kid was lying, saying that he was taken to this church.
Okay, this is a kid where in one of the debates over the
in
bans.
a Huffington Post article
Yeah.
Last year. And so then the question is, where is the church? Where is the machine? Where are the people? Well, I don't remember.
Yeah.
It's like Bigfoot.
In other words, we've gotten to a point where the media has committed such egregious lies and in their own profession, such journalistic malpractice, that the other side is able to float these preposterous fibs to further their agenda. And this is where I fault the Republican Party, and I think you should start with the Republicans. Laurie tries, and it's very difficult, especially in a blue state. You have to demand that the Republicans honor their own platform and try to take action, because what we're seeing is this is so politically incorrect, and the media is so sold on these so-called conversion therapy bans, which I love what Darren calls them. Let's adopt this language. Anti-heterosexuality affirming therapy bans.
You got a double negative there, but close.
Okay, what is it again?
It'd be anti-heterosexual affirming therapy.
Okay, yeah, anti-heterosexual affirming therapy. Because so often our side is using the language, but this is a very tough time, because effectively it's like George Orwell. It's like the Bible says, Isaiah 5:20, evil is good and good is evil. And some of the things we're talking about just aren't happening, and yet the debate is being conducted apart from people like Laurie and Denise, who are trying to get the truth out, and Christopher Doyle and David Pickup and Stephen Black. Those people are not solicited by the media. And so the media discussion is so irresponsible. They talked about McCarthyism. It's really sort of a liberal McCarthyism, even though I don't like using that word, because McCarthy was actually, it's a whole long story. But this is such propaganda that it's hard to even have a debate.
I want to give a little bit of hope about this.
Yeah.
In the state of Oklahoma, David Pickup and I, and this is the way you have to do it. You go to the committee. You find out who's on the committees. You find out, you watch where this is starting to develop in the states. And you go and you talk to these people. And you actually talk to them about some of the things that even Laurie had brought up, and Darren, specifically, do you understand, that this is child abuse? Bottom line, this is child abuse. How is it child abuse? Let me unpack that for you. And then you go to the committee meeting. And then when you go to the committee meeting, you say, I want a voice. And if you get, like at this particular committee meeting, my friend Sally Kern just happened to be chairing it. And I said, we want to testify. And we were able to come in and testify. And boom, in committee, it was killed.
I got a question for Denise. Denise, how did we get to the point where parents just started saying, oh yeah, it's normal they talk to some professional and say, it's normal for me to help my child alter his or her body to become who they are. How did we get to the point where the parents were such victims of this propaganda that they're actually pushing this on their own children?
Wow.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's a packed question. In essence of how did we get here where parents are saying, hey, okay, you want to be Sally? Let's go see the doctor and see what kind of hormone blockers. To be in this place, I look at, to be honest, and I say, what's wrong with the parents? Why are they accepting this kind of ideology, that is putting their child at great consequences in their life? I think some of that has happened because of the push in society and within the churches. I think it was you, Laurie, that said, where are the churches today? We're kind of the old things, so families aren't going to church. They're not receiving the Word of God, the teaching of God, or the children that are coming into the youth groups. This thing's just gone so crazy, so fast. I never in my lifetime thought that I would be seeing what I'm seeing now at my age. What I'm waiting for, and I don't say this with a smile in my heart, but I want to see the first adult child that's going to come back and sue the parents and the medical field for going along with this propaganda when their brain doesn't develop until it's mid-20s.
That's right.
And to be able to say at 9, 10 years old, okay, and then start this whole thing. They know that. They know that.
Yeah, this. I mean,
Yes.
anybody who's got, I have teenage children. If you're an adult and you're taking everything your teenage child says or thinks at face value, you're nuts. You know, teenagers do all sorts of crazy things, and we're supposed to take a teenager or even a preteen who wants to be the opposite sex and say, okay, or Laurie, you can address this. I know that one of the ways it's happening, one of the ways is the threat of suicide. Children are threatening their parents that they will commit suicide, try to commit suicide, if they are not allowed to pursue their gender identity.
Well, I have 3 things that I want to say about how we've gotten here, and it's exploding. Denise has said it. There's studies both in England and Australia. The number of children, particularly adolescents, and especially adolescent girls, they have a term for it. It's rapid onset gender dysphoria, where kids who never identified as gender dysphoric or the opposite sex suddenly say it one day. And I would say the phenomenon, I think, is a number of things. Number 1, teenagers are rebellious. Number 2, we have such profound family dysfunction in this culture. So you have the rebellion, these broken families. Now it's the cool thing to do to either be gender non-binary or gender fluid or identify as a trans boy or trans girl. So that's, we see when Bruce Jenner comes out, the whole culture celebrates it. So now you see these kids doing it. Then you have the politicization of the medical communities, medical and mental health. We know that from homosexuality, what happened with the APA, we know what happened in 1973. So these groups are dominated by liberals who are affirming this. You have the movement itself, the whole sort of sexual revolution, which is continuing to go on. And then parents are terrified. They're terrified, even if their kids don't say it, the culture is telling them that their kids are going to commit suicide unless they do that. And the vast majority of kids do not commit suicide. There's a difference between having suicidal ideation or even saying you're going to do it and actually attempting it. The number of kids who attempt it, the percentage is very small, and the ones who succeed are even smaller because usually an attempt is more of a cry for help. But the one thing that I wanted to say is the leftists, whether they're in the medical community or not, cite the American Academy of Pediatrics, the traditional one that has 66,000 members, and saying they affirm the trans-affirming protocol they have. Well, I did an article about it, which I wish had gotten more press because I thought it was hugely important. I went and investigated and talked to Michelle Cretella, who's in the,
Explain who Michelle Cretella is.
Michelle Cretella started another, with some other people, split off. I mean, she's still a member, I think, of the AAP, but she's split off, and it's the American College of Pediatricians, and they did it because the AAP had become so politicized, and the AMA has been, and the APA.
American
so
Medical
all the mental
Association.
health and the medical. But what I found out from her, and also another doctor who used to be a president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I found out that of the 66,000 members, there is a committee of about 10 or 12 who formulated the trans-affirming protocol. They created it. 2 of those people are on this 10 or 12, I don't have my article with me, are homosexual themselves. Another one, I suspect is, but I wasn't able to confirm it. Another one, and I don't have her name, I think her first name is Ellen. Her adult son is homosexual and raising a child. They created this trans-affirming protocol, which then goes to another 10 or so of kind of an executive committee that vote on it, and that's it. So of the 66,000, I'm not saying that there's no one else who supports it. We have no idea. It never goes to the AAP. It never goes to the full body. They don't vote on it. There's no minority report. And most of the members of the AAP don't hear about these things until it comes out in a press release. So the next time that you hear someone say that, you might have that statistic at the ready that it's really about 24 people in the AAP that created and voted on the policy.
Right, which takes us back to the change in 1973, I believe it was, where homosexuality was removed as a mental disorder. And
For political reasons.
yes, it was a bullying effort by homosexual activists. They would storm meetings like this. Say
Right.
this was a professional meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. They stormed the meeting. They put flyers under the door of psychiatrists in hotels, staying for meetings. And there's a wonderful quote by a guy named Charles Silverstein, who's a very radical activist, who basically said the psychiatrists were no match for the gay activists because the gay activists understood political theater, they understood political activism, and they just effectively pushed them to the point, and there was no general meeting vote of the whole body. They changed that, and that was a monumental thing in the history of homosexuality because that removed, at least on paper, removed the idea that homosexuality was a disorder.
Psychological war
right.
against the psychologists, and they did not even recognize it.
Right,
That's pitiful.
right.
And that's exactly what we see going on throughout the schools. The radical supporters of this agenda, the trans and the homosexual agenda, they're using the same type tactics.
Sure.
As far as they are intimidating the parents who are expressing concern about this. In addition, they are rewriting history. I mean, this is LGBT History Month.
Yeah, which we
and-
reiterate, Comcast is sponsoring with who knows what, well, they've donated already in time. Comcast is sponsoring Gay and Lesbian History Month
Right, the
with
spots.
false histories, which I include people who were not even historically known. There's no consensus that they were, quote, gay,
Well, I
are
call-
being put on that list.
Right. I call it picking on the dead guys because, to them, Abraham Lincoln was homosexual. David and Jonathan were homosexuals. Ruth and Naomi, they were homosexuals. I mean, picking on the dead guys. That's the way I put it.
I think they said Cary Grant might have been a homosexual, and Cary Grant's former ex-wife came out and said this is false.
Well,
but I think
yeah.
he's on the somebody like that is on the list.
But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, they're rewriting history. You go to Philadelphia to the National Museum on the American Revolution, and you will learn that if it wasn't for the homosexuals and transgenders, we would never have won that war.
How did they do that?
Well, they highlight a few who are. There was one woman who, they just rewrite history. They take an individual, and decide they're gay. They're saying that who was it? Baron who? Yeah, him. He came over and trained our armies to act like, trained our ragtag army and Valley Forge to actually act like an army. And supposedly he had a trail of gay lovers, all throughout Europe. That's why he was disgraced, and George Washington brought him over. Benjamin Franklin came to his defense in Europe, and they snuck him on a boat to bring him over here so that he wouldn't be prosecuted in Europe, and it's just totally twisting history, taking a snippet, and there was never any proof that he had any homosexual lovers. But they are so good at taking a snippet or some little part of someone's history and twisting it and rewriting it. In 2015, June, Gay Pride Month, or when I went to the Philadelphia Gay Pride Parade, right before the decision, the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court, the National Constitution Center had what's called Speaking Equality exhibit. And because it happened to fall on Flag Day, we get in free. No, for $5. It's $5 to get in the National Constitution Center. But Bill, you met Bill. He was our tour guide when you went to the Philadelphia Gay Pride Parade with me several years ago. But anyway, the first...
Not to Mars, just clarify.
Well, true, not to March. We were going to videotape and sneak into the festival. But they couldn't sneak out. Anyway, the first... When you first go in the exhibit, the first thing you hear is about, or you read about, is a story of Uncle Fred, who was suspected of being homosexual, and he had a lobotomy. I mean, that was the beginning. That's how they started the whole exhibit. Then it goes through the gay pride parades in Philadelphia, which happened before Stonewall, so they're claiming that that's where it all started. It was a homosexual movement started in Philly in front of Independence Hall. all through Jerry Falwell and Anita Bryant with a pie in the face, and all through that. And then at the very end, you would have an opportunity to write why the Supreme Court decision for marriage equality, how that would impact you. Of course, I didn't write anything, but it's mostly is full of people who have no idea what the history is, have no idea what the agenda is and the tactics these people use. But the National Constitution Center was complicit in having this exhibit. And it was just very disturbing to me. And I love history. And to see what they're doing to our nation's history in the attempt to make it appear that homosexuals have been an integral part of the founding of this nation, forgetting the fact that in all 13 colonies, homosexuality was illegal. And Pennsylvania had one of the least harsh laws of the 13 colonies. And that was, if you were caught in a homosexual act, then you would be stripped of all the property you owned and be sentenced to 10 years hard labor. That was one of the least strict laws.
Well, Diane,
a lot of them it was death.
Harvey Milk, Obama put Harvey Milk on a stamp and named a Navy ship after Harvey Milk.
A Navy oil freighter, his name.
Oh,
it's an oiler.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as far as I can tell, Harvey Milk is a statutory rapist. He had sex as a sexual relationship in his 30s with a 16-year-old runaway boy hustler. So, again, we have to try to bring out accuracy. What can we do? We have to try to bring some accuracy to the history, but the history is going to become, like everything else in our society, a political tool to propagandize young people.
Can I say something? Are you want to say something?
Go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say, as a point of history, which isn't being talked a whole lot about, is that just what Justice Kennedy did. Because I think what Justice Kennedy did was tragic, and that he knew he was given amicus briefs with
for the Obergefell decision.
Yes, on the gay marriage issue, so-called gay marriage, which is that he knew that it wasn't immutable, and yet when you read his reason for voting, it specifically says because it's immutable. So he lied to the American people, and that's not. Where's that in the news? He knew for sure, because he had these amicus briefs of people like myself and many others.
So basically,
they were submitted.
What Stephen's saying is
testimonies.
Justice Kennedy treated homosexuality like race to reinforce his idea that homosexuality was a civil rights issue. And obviously,
that's
one of
right.
the components of that normally would be race. You can't change your race. There's no such thing as an ex-black or an ex-Hispanic. You can't change your heritage. And so he affirmed that homosexuality is unchangeable to justify his pro-same-sex marriage decision that he wrote. And he was appointed by Ronald Reagan, by the way.
Yes, that's right.
So when we talk about the amicus briefs against gay marriage, there were 6 of us adult children that had partnered up to co-author briefs on our experiences with our parents and saying why it's so important for a child to have a mother and father, in these type of situations. We arrived in D.C. with the attorney who was gracious to us on his part, and he went to go turn in the amicus briefs with one of the other ones because some of us were doing interviews. And you would not have believed the trouble that this attorney had and how they were saying, well, we misplaced this, we can't find this, and it was a whole bunch of shenanigans that he had gone through. And the fact that when we got to D.C., it was like everybody was trying to shush their mouths that we were even in town. So to see how some of that played out in the political field, you felt like as an adult child having a voice, you didn't have a voice. And when we look at that spiritually, we see where the enemy's trying to constantly silence the voice of the children, no matter what perspective or what situation you come from in these. I know for 6 years I was involved in the bathroom bills in Maryland, in Annapolis. There was a doctor that got a hold of me, and it was just bringing a testimony in regards to I had lost privacy in our bathroom as well in our home. My dad had a peek hole that I had discovered one day when I got out of the shower, heard this noise didn't know what, like what was that? Nobody was there. And it caused me to take the shampoo and, just kind of move things around. And I'll be darned if I didn't find a hole and my dad went flying out the door. And so to be able to speak what that is like for young girls, the fact that you lose that freedom, that privacy that you have without a male, looking over the stall or whatever have you. To further that, asking the politicians, we would, as family members, we would rather that you spend your valuable time in trying to help our loved ones, come up with some solutions, some treatments, some things. And there was one senator, the last year, the year we lost it, he looked at me, because of course you've got the transgender activists, and they were packed the last 2 years.
This is Maryland, right?
This was Maryland.
Yeah.
And the one senator looked at me who was friends with a trans, very wealthy trans person, and he said, "So you're trying to tell me that my friend is crazy?" I said, "Sir, those aren't my words, those are yours." So to see how they can manipulate their own thoughts and to try and make you look like you're out to say. Exactly. I just want to go back for a second when you were talking about the culture, and Laurie, when you were talking about the peer pressure. When I travel out to California, some of the families that I meet and the stories that I hear even out there, there is a high school that has 3 girls that have been friends for years, and they're in high school now. And all 3 of them have decided to transition. There's a lot of peer.
Have you seen Fourth Wave Now?
Yes.
And Gender Trender? These are
Could you
parents.
repeat those? Yeah, or give her the.
Oh, you did them? You talked about them?
No, say it in
Oh, in the microphone. Oh, okay. I thought you said the video. There's 2 websites, Fourth Wave Now and Gender Trender, and these are not conservative parents, but they're parents who are very concerned about how easy it's talked. The term is gatekeeping, when people go to a counselor or a doctor and they will be interviewed about, they'll be counseled about their gender dysphoria, and these are parents who are complaining the gatekeeping is awful. In other words, you can go for a minor or a young adult can go for one visit to a counselor, and they have, gender dysphoria is much more common among autistic kids. So even if they're just a little bit on the autism spectrum. And so this one mother was writing and said her child has a very complicated medical and mental health history, and also was experiencing gender dysphoria, and was autistic. And one visit with a counselor, and her daughter was on testosterone. And so the child was over 18, gone off to college, and so the gatekeeping is really bad. But some of these parents have talked about that they have their child and 2 of their girls are all suddenly identifying as gender dysphoric. And we know that you can see those suicide trends sometimes in high school where there'll be 3, 4, 5 kids over the course of a year. They call it a social contagion. The same thing is happening with this trend.
Who are trying to commit suicide, or who have
you've
tried?
read that in the past, haven't you heard about high schools that have a social contagion of suicides? And it's the same thing is happening with this trans thing. Even though gender dysphoria in very young children is much more common among boys, this rapid onset or sudden onset gender dysphoria is much more common among girls. They're much more sort of influenceable, girls are, than boys. I wanted to say one thing. When I was working at Deerfield High School, because I was a little bit pretty open about all this stuff, we were talking about trans stuff, but a colleague in the English department who was new came to me. She was married. She had 2 very young children, and she told me that her husband experienced gender dysphoria. Well, she described it as he struggles with wanting to be a woman. And so we talked for a long time, and I think I was the only one that she felt comfortable even sharing this with, because she was a Christian and conservative. I don't think they are anymore, but conservative Christians. But here's the interesting thing. We finished that whole discussion, and then I was just asking her about her family, and their background, just general get to know you kind of stuff. And it came out that her husband his father, they're Korean, she and her husband. Her father had been a very, very, very well-known pastor in South Korea. So one day, the mother and father of her husband had said they were going to take a nap, and he was 7 and his sister was 5, and they said, watch your sister. Well, he didn't. He was 7. He didn't watch her carefully. She ran out, was hit by a car, and killed. Sometime after that, South Korea, which I didn't know, she told me is a very superstitious culture. So the congregation thought God must be punishing him, for the father, for something really horrible. He lost his church. So this little boy blamed himself for his sister's death, his dad. Sometime after that, he started wishing to be a girl. She told me this story as completely irrelevant, and I said, you don't think this has anything to do with his guilt over his sister? And she said, oh my gosh, no one ever said, and he'd been in counseling. And this is not about me being, everyone in here hears me tell the story and is going, what? So this is how trauma can affect this. And this guy has never had, he'd seen a counselor about the guilt about his sisters, but they never connected. Maybe in fairness, maybe he never told the counselor that he wished to be a woman, but his wife knew all that. And she hadn't even put it together.
I have a similar story of a guy who once identified as gay, and I was talking with him, and he shared how when he was a child in his crib, he witnessed his mother, I think, being raped by his uncle or by some relative or some friend. He witnessed this in the crib, and I immediately thought, well, couldn't this have had an effect on your confusion and it's just, this happens over and over again. I want to say for the record on this transgender issue, before I forget, that there is a very important political race involving a state representative named Bob Marshall in Virginia, who is up against a transgender candidate who's going by the name Danica Rome. And just to show you what, Bob Marshall is almost like a hero among conservatives in Virginia. He's the guy who promotes the great legislation. He actually helped come up with the Hyde Amendment, which defunded abortion. I think no funding abroad on the Hyde Amendment is no funding for abortion, right, through the federal government. No taxpayer dollars toward abortion. He had a role in the creation of that. Well, anyways, this Danica Rome identifies as transgender, running against Bob Marshall. One guy was mad at Trump and gave this guy, Danica Rome, a $45,000 donation. The spending is through the roof. One report shows out of another state, if people know that this person is identifying as the opposite sex, the support would go way down. But of course, the media is not making an issue of that. And now this is a tight race. And here we have. They want to knock out the pro-family guy. Diane, I'm sure you've seen this over and over again. Stephen, we saw this with Sally Kern. The force is so big and powerful. A lot of times they'll zero in on just a state legislator in in Texas or something.
Roy Moore is a perfect example of that as far as in Alabama.
Except Roy Moore is so strong in his own defense. What happens is sometimes, I'm talking about like at a state level, you'll have somebody who says, yeah, I really think homosexuality is a sin or something. And what happens is the gay lobby, like this, clicks in, target, and all of a sudden this little state legislator over in Texas is getting thousands of letters because they have a much quicker system of activism, which we have to develop if we're ever going to be able to fight back effectively, because they can do it on a dime. And something called change.org all of a sudden thousands of letters can become pouring into this little district, and it's intimidating. Imagine.
Yeah. And I think part of that is the lack of technological knowledge on our side aren't technologically savvy. And we need to be educated on how to do that, because some people may not even know it. I'm sure everyone in here knows what change.org is. But as far as other ones on our side, they may have no idea. And I have people who they will not get the internet in their house because it's evil. It's evil. Not realizing that if you don't have the access to that technology, we can't counter this. It's past the time of writing a letter to your legislator. By the time you write a letter to the legislator, whatever you're writing about is past history. But I was going to address the Republican thing. We have in Pennsylvania, we have a physician general. That position was was created under Tom Ridge, very pro-abortion Republican.
What, a physician?
Physician general, okay. Our current governor is a very liberal Democrat, Tom Wolf. And one of the first acts that he did when he first became governor, I think it was in 2015, he nominated a transgender woman, which means a biological man, to be the physician general. And if you look at his picture, you know it's a man. But anyway, he goes by the name, and he is a doctor, adolescent doctor. And he was confirmed by our Republican-dominated Senate. Confirmed unanimously. So last week,
Unanimously. So not one Republican could voice an objection.
And I talked. I mean, our senator, excuse me, our state senator is conservative because we come from a conservative area of the state, and I talked to him, and after the vote, he again unanimous. So Scott voted for this person. And I cornered him at the next Republican meeting, and Scott said, our state senator said, well, she was qualified. I said, it's a he. And it doesn't matter whether this person's qualified. What message are you sending to the youth of Pennsylvania by doing this? But anyway, last week, Governor Wolf is choosing to promote this individual to be the next, of all things, Secretary of Health in Pennsylvania. So again, he's got to go through the confirmation process. So we'll just wait and see what the still Republican-dominated Senate does in this case.
Okay, I've got, you guys, we're an hour and then 15 minutes past the schedule, so I think we're going to allow one more question that I promised to Rob. Do you still want to ask it? And then we're going to have to, I think people have flights coming out, so we're not going to be able to continue, but I've been blessed by this. This has been phenomenal, so
I just want to make it real quick because I know everybody wants to get out of here. But I heard a little bit about the addiction connection between homosexuality, and sexual addiction. And then you had mentioned, the schools are creating, you go right through up to 18, ready to go, start your journey going into the bars. And they're having these floats in the parades with alcohol and everything. So what's being done about is anything being said about the addiction connection? I'm a drug and alcohol counselor for the state of Illinois, and I don't hear a lot about that connection. I'm sure in the book on all the CDCs has some numbers and things like that, but is there anybody addressing that connection?
And before you answer, Stephen, there's also the phenomenon of so-called chemsex parties, chemical sex parties, in which you're combining the serious drug abuse of things like crystal and with orgiastic parties. This is something they're talking about, the problem of chemsex. So, Stephen, talk about drugs and alcohol and the whole connection.
Well, we already know that it's prolific among people that are dealing with homosexuality, sexual addiction, and the trans issue. And you're right, it's not being focused like it should be. And none of this is actually being brought to light like it should be. And so I think in closing, we really should ask Jesus Christ to, honestly, we need a movement in the church. We should have been able to get a facility that had 10 times more people if we were actually doing what we're supposed to be doing. And so you're bringing in a question which is actually the issue that has to be interceded and prayed for, because there isn't the focused attention that it needs. And again, it kind of goes back to what Leonard Ravenhill says. I know it seems silly, but it's very profound that we worship King Sport and Queen Entertainment, and we really need to make headway in the church to stop this. And it begins with you. And every single time, when I don't care how big the crowd is, it begins with you. It begins with you.
And we have to pray that we have the same miracle.
That's right.
That got Trump into office.
That's right. And you know what? God can and will do it. I think he's looking for a people across the face of the earth whose hearts are fully His, who will truly intercede and pray. I am praying every day in brokenness and asking God for a miracle, that this would be and I think what is coming, and I'm just say it, I think we're headed for something disastrous along paralleled with something amazing. And that's what we've seen historically with revival, is we will probably see something disastrous in our nation that will bring us to our knees, that will make 9/11 look something small. And then God will, He will usher in revival. But let's pray for mercy. I would rather not have something a whole lot worse than 9/11. And that begins with every one of you praying and me praying. Amen? Amen.
Go ahead.
I would love for, can we pray?
Sure.
Let's
Absolutely.
pray. The Lord what? Amen. He is going to return. We don't know when, but He is. Let's pray. Let's ask the Lord for His great mercy. And God, Lord, let our tears, let our broken hearts over what we are seeing in our nation be an offering to You, Almighty God, that we ask in the name of Jesus that You would have mercy, that You would have mercy on our nation, that You would have mercy, Lord, in the churches, that You would give us, Lord, as been prayed over me, we would have pastors with hearts of compassion, backbones of steel. Lord, give us men of courage and women of courage to rise up in the church and to say enough is enough. God, I pray in the name of Jesus that You would have mercy. And God, I pray that You would stir in our own hearts to not stop praying, that we would intercede with great passion. And as it is written, Lord, You said the violent take it by force, that means that we have a heart filled with being full of faith to say, Lord, let Your will be done as it is in heaven. Let it come to earth. Rather than being passive with little bullet prayers, Lord, I pray that You would set Your church on fire to pray like it's never prayed, that we would see Your hope and Your desire, that in this dance of this thing that You instituted as an economy of Your righteous ways called prayer. God, we need this economy established, that we would intercede and see a movement that actually addresses all of this evil in our land. And Lord, yes, we expose it because light exposes darkness, but light also gives life. And I pray that Your church, we, begin with me, would be a conduit of love and life. For Jesus' sake, for Jesus' glory, for the name and the glorious name of Jesus to go forward. In that name we pray. And all the church says, amen. Amen. Peter.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. And next year, Walt higher. So we don't know where it's going to be, but thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Denise and Diane and Laurie. Thanks to everybody who's participated. Thank you so much. This is also supposed to be a fundraiser for AFTAH, so if you haven't made a contribution, we're taking contributions, and also the book deals we have, you can pre-order a copy of a video copy of this whole event. It's the yellow sheet in the back, $25. Pre-order a copy, and that will be the entire thing you'll get. Probably within a month. This entire DVD, 2 DVDs. And also the Health Hazards of Homosexuality book for a $100 gift comes along with that. So that's 2 things.